Let's talk about using bands and chains in training, otherwise known as accommodating resistance. 90% of the time, I don't love accommodating resistance for raw lifters, though there's 10% of the time where it can be effective. It's not as black and white as people think. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, and we'll get into that today. While bands and chains have now been adopted by raw lifters, they initially came from the geared powerlifting community, right? And geared lifting involves using a squat suit, bench shirt, or a deadlift suit to assist your lift. These bands essentially mimic the resistance curve of these suited movements, right? As the suit helps you a little bit more at the bottom of each movement and helps a little bit less as it goes on, right? So it's a way for geared lifters to kind of mimic that same resistance curve without actually having to put on the full suit every single training session and use the full weights that they can handle when they're in that suit. So a traditional band or chain setup would change the resistance curve of an exercise to overload the top end or the lockout a little bit more, increasing tension as the lift goes on, whereas something like a reverse band setup does kind of a similar thing in the opposite fashion, right? It assists you a little bit more and assists the weight at the bottom and assists a little bit less as that lift goes on at lockout. Now, the same reason that I don't love bands and chains for raw lifters is the same reason that geared lifters love them, right? It is specific to the resistance curve of a geared movement. You're overloading that lockout because that's what the suits do, right? For a raw lifter, this isn't gonna happen in your meet, right? It's not gonna be harder at the top, it's the same weight all the way through. And so I would much rather you get your training volume in from movements that are a little bit more comp specific by keeping that same weight or same tension throughout the entirety of the movement. Now, this doesn't mean that bands and chains have no place in the program of a raw lifter, right? They do have some efficacy. One of the big ones being lockout strengthening. Because the tension is much higher at the top end of the movement, it can really help you to push through that sticking point by overloading the point that you may be weakest at. Now, I don't like these as much for squats or sumo deadlifts simply because the resistance curve of those two exercises means that the exercise is going to be a little bit tougher at the bottom. The lockout of both of those is usually very, very easy because you're in a more mechanically advantageous position. But however, on something like a bench press or a conventional deadlift, bands and chains are definitely great tools to overload the lockout there. They also can help to teach explosiveness. This is one of the big arguments for bands and chains. Proponents of them really want you to work on exploding into the bar. I more so like to just teach lifters to do that every single rep, whether there's a band, chain, or straight weight on the bar, it doesn't really matter. But it is kind of a good reminder to work on exploding all the way through, as those bands and chains will catch up with you pretty quick if you're kind of sandbagging your lifts. They're good variation in the off season as well. You know, getting away from a comp movement as well a little bit can definitely help, and it can kind of help you to stop chasing numbers because instead of some giant PR that you've been chasing for years and years and years, bands and chains, you don't really know how much weight is at the top of the lift, or maybe you do, but it's not as specific. It doesn't mean that you actually hit that big PR right, and it makes those numbers a little bit less scary. It's great for working on injuries as well. Oftentimes lifters will experience some pain in the bottom of the movement at a certain weight, right? Maybe some hip pain at the bottom of the squat or some shoulder pain at the bottom of a bench. Throwing bands and chains on can allow you to train with heavier weights overall, heavy weights at the top end of that movement, right? While still kind of avoiding the injury or the range of motion that causes pain under such a heavy load. This allows us to keep a similar amount of volume up in your program, right? Although I would rather you get most of that volume from comp-specific movements with straight weight, if you can kind of get it with bands and chains and minimize injury risk and minimize pain, it's the next best thing, right? So it's still a great option to keep your training volumes relatively high even while working around an injury. It can also help you to overcome mental blocks, as sometimes people may get in their head, say you're worried about a 315 bench, right? And every time it's loaded up, you get a little bit nervous and cautious, but maybe you throw bands on, you do 275 plus bands, 295 plus bands, 305 plus bands. At that point, you know that straight weight 315 is gonna fly, but you never had to kind of face it until you knew you were gonna be able to get that through that weight, right? Again, you could build up similarly with 5-pound increments in regular weight. Maybe you hit 310 for a double and you know you can crush that 315, right? So it's not like bands and chains are necessary to break through these blocks, but they can help in some cases. So while the use of bands and chains does have some efficacy, even for raw lifters, the take-home point is that it will never be as comp-specific as possible, right? You are never going to be training in the most optimal way for a raw lifter because you're not mimicking the end goal. However, if it allows you to continue training at higher volumes, to get more overload, to break through a mental sticking point, cool, absolutely use it. It's another tool in your toolbox and it does have a place in your training. However, if you're able to use straight weight, that's typically what we're gonna prefer.